I dedicated to my life to helping other people, and I think that was the one thing that really helped me with my addiction.
His scarred face and chest-covered tattoos have made Danny Trejo an icon of Hollywood's most ruthless villains for 4 decades. The film industry paid millions of dollars for this star to wield a machete and spread terror on screen. Audiences have always believed him to be a born devil, but behind that violent facade lies a heartbreaking truth that has just been revealed. Few know that this notorious gangster once knelt in a gas chamber awaiting death and secretly concealed a deadly disease for fear of being rejected by Hollywood. What few truly understand is that his survival and return are even more astonishing than any of his roles. So, who is Danny Trejo really? The story of Danny Trejo will shock us. Danny Trejo was born on May 16, 1944, in Maywood, California. His mother, Dolores Rivera King, was legally married to another man at the time, a soldier serving overseas during the height of World War II. But in 1943, while her husband was away, Dolores went to a dance hall in Highland Park, Los Angeles, where she met Dionisio Dan Trejo. Born in 1922, Dionisio was a construction worker, a Mexican-American, and a key member of a street gang known as 38th Street. Their relationship led to Dolores becoming pregnant. And when Danny was born, neither side of the family accepted the child. To them, he was not an innocent baby. He was seen as a mark of shame, living proof of betrayal. Dolores already had a daughter named Diane from her legal marriage, and Danny spent his earliest years living with his mother and his half-sister in a home filled with instability. That unease did not last long before it turned into something far more dangerous. In Los Angeles, Dionisio stabbed another man and left him seriously wounded. Police quickly issued a warrant for his arrest, and to avoid capture, he forced Dolores, little Diane, and baby Danny to flee the city with him. They traveled all the way to San Antonio, Texas, where they moved between cheap rented rooms and changed locations constantly to stay out of sight. For about a year, the family lived as fugitives, always in motion, always under pressure, until they eventually returned to Los Angeles. There, Dionisio made a sudden decision. He walked into a police station and surrendered. While Dionisio was in prison, Danny remained with his mother, but in 1949, when Danny was just 5 years old, a small childhood accident changed the entire direction of his life. While playing, he fell and sprained his arm. Dionisio, now out of prison, used that injury as legal ammunition. He took the case to court and claimed Dolores was unfit to care for a child. The court agreed. Dionisio took custody of Danny and secured a restraining order that barred Dolores from coming near her own son. What followed was not a brief separation. It became a 16-year exile. From 1949 to 1965, Danny Trejo did not see his mother's face. He did not reunite with his sister Diane. From the age of 5 until he was 21, there was no physical contact, no phone call, and no letter from the woman who had given birth to him. Dionisio brought Danny to live with his grandmother on Temple Street in the Echo Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. The house was cramped, crowded, and full of relatives. Danny had to share a tiny room with several cousins, sometimes even sharing the same bed. In that environment, he learned very early how to disappear without leaving. He taught himself to stay quiet, take up as little space as possible, and avoid drawing attention. Later, Dionisio remarried a woman named Alice Mendias. Alice cared for Danny in the most basic ways. She gave him food, looked after him, and offered the small acts of warmth that kept him going. But none of that changed the reality of the house. Dionisio remained violent, unstable, and deeply controlling. He drank heavily, lost control often, and turned cruelty into a daily routine. Every morning, he would walk into the bedroom, stand beside Danny's bed, and place both hands around the boy's throat. That was how he woke him up. The pressure on the child's neck would force him awake in panic, gasping for air. Danny had not broken any rule the night before, but a child's mind does not always understand injustice. Slowly, he began to believe he must have done something wrong, something serious enough to deserve this. And that is how violence became normal. That is how punishment became part of waking up. Alice saw it happen, but she did not have the physical strength to stop Dionisio. All she could do was wait for him to leave for work. Then she would come to Danny, put medicine on the bruises around his neck, feed him, and speak to him gently, reminding him in the only way she could that he still mattered. In a house ruled by fear, Alice became his only source of comfort, and with a father who taught power through violence. Danny Trejo began looking elsewhere for an example of how a man survives. Then his uncle, Gilbert Trejo, became his new male figure. Gilbert was only 6 years older than Danny, close enough in age to feel less like an uncle and more like a powerful older brother. He wore expensive street clothes, carried thick rolls of cash in his pockets, and moved with the confidence of someone who seemed to control the rules of the world around him. For a boy starved of love and stability, that kind of presence was magnetic. Danny followed him almost immediately, and Gilbert began leading his nephew into crime with chilling consistency. In 1951, when Danny was just 7 years old, Gilbert brought him along to a drug deal. He carried a package of narcotics, met the buyer, handed over the drugs, and took the cash while Danny stood there watching. At 7 years old, Danny had already taken part in his first drug transaction. A year later, in 1952, Gilbert lit a marijuana cigarette and handed it to his 8-year-old nephew. Danny inhaled, choked as the smoke filled his lungs, and kept going. Gilbert offered no warning, no explanation of what it could do to a child's body. Instead, he turned it into a shared secret between them. And for Danny, that secret carried a dangerous kind of comfort. For the first time, he felt like he belonged to someone. The slide into criminal life happened fast. In 1954, at the age of 10, Danny assaulted someone on the street. Police arrived, handcuffed him, and took him to the station. He was placed in a cell, marking the first time his freedom was taken away. But the moment that truly shaped the tragedy came in 1956, when Danny was 12. He walked into a room and saw Gilbert injecting a liquid into his vein. It was heroin. Danny stepped closer and threatened to tell the adults unless Gilbert let him try it too. Gilbert took out a fresh syringe, mixed heroin powder with water, tied a rubber strip around Danny's arm to find a vein, and pushed the needle through the skin, sending hard drugs straight into the bloodstream of a 12-year-old child. Danny's body reacted instantly. He convulsed, collapsed onto the floor. His eyes rolled back, and he stopped breathing. He overdosed the very first time he used heroin. Gilbert panicked. He slammed both hands against Danny's chest, threw cold water in his face, and slapped him hard across both cheeks, trying to force his body back to life. After several minutes at the edge of death, Danny finally gasped for air and opened his eyes. He survived, but the line had already been crossed. Only days later, his body began craving the drug. A 12-year-old with no money made a choice that would lock him in even deeper. He went looking for Gilbert and offered to work in exchange for heroin. Danny started running errands, carrying plastic bags filled with white powder to customers, collecting cash, sitting on park benches to watch for police, and bringing the money back to his uncle. Whatever he earned went straight into heroin. When he could not get heroin, he bought hard liquor to survive the withdrawal. Gilbert did not just supply drugs. He also trained Danny's body through savage beatings. He would make him put on gloves, then throw full-force punches until Danny crashed to the floor. Gilbert would order him to stand, and the moment he got back up, another punch would smash into his face and send him down again. It happened over and over until Danny's body adapted to pain in the face and chest. He learned how to react, how to hit back, not for sport, not for discipline, but to build himself into a weapon that could survive the street. From 1959 to 1969, Danny Trejo's life became a cycle of movement through California's prison system. Authorities transferred him through some of the state's harshest institutions, including Tracy, Vacaville, Susanville, Sierra, Folsom, Soledad, and San Quentin. During the brief periods when he was free, he returned to crime with even greater violence. He bought live grenades, hid them in his jacket, walked into liquor stores, pulled the pin, and held them up to force the owners to hand over every dollar in the register. He used the robbery money to buy heroin and took part in drive-by gun battles with rival gangs on the streets of Los Angeles. In 1961, while jailed in Los Angeles County Jail, Danny met a prisoner who looked weak, filthy, and half-broken. His clothes were stained, and instead of a belt, he used a torn strip of cloth tied around his waist. That man was Charles Manson. Manson approached Danny's group and claimed he had the power to hypnotize people, to create a drug like high without using any chemicals at all. Danny's group agreed to test him. Manson told them to sit down, then began speaking in a flat, steady voice, describing physical sensations in detail. Minutes later, Danny felt a wave of heat move up his spine and through his arms. To him, it felt strikingly similar to the effect of a mild drug. A deal followed. Manson would clean the cell and scrub the toilets. In exchange, Danny's group would protect him, making it clear that anyone who wanted to attack Manson would first have to deal with Danny's fists. 8 years later, in 1969, Charles Manson directed his followers to carry out a series of brutal Hollywood murders. In 1965, at the age of 21, Danny took an order for 4 ounces of white powder. He delivered the package, collected the money, and then watched the buyer pull out a badge and a gun. The customer was an undercover federal agent. Prosecutors charged Danny with heroin trafficking. In court, Danny insisted the package contained nothing more than plain white sugar, but the judge rejected the defense and sentenced him to 10 years in prison. Guards transported him to San Quentin State Prison, the facility on San Francisco Bay that housed a gas chamber for executions. Inside San Quentin, violence unfolded in front of him every day. Prisoners divided physical territory in the yard by race, and anyone who crossed the line could be stabbed to death. On one occasion, Danny was walking on a metal staircase when he saw a prisoner drive a knife deep into another man's chest. The victim staggered forward, coughing blood, gripping the handle buried in his own body before collapsing onto the concrete. Every prisoner nearby stood completely still. In that place, silence was one of the highest laws of survival. To protect himself, Danny lifted weights every day, built muscle, signed up for boxing, and used the punishment he had endured since childhood to overpower anyone who stood across from him. He went on to win both the lightweight and welterweight prison boxing titles, turning his fists into a shield strong enough to make other inmates think twice before coming after him. On May 5, 1968, Danny Trejo was serving time at the Soledad Correctional Training Facility. That day was Cinco de Mayo, and the prison administration allowed inmates to gather in the main yard for the celebration. What began as a small argument between 2 groups of prisoners quickly escalated. One inmate threw a punch, and within seconds, the tension exploded into a full-scale riot. Hundreds of prisoners surged into the fight, swinging fists and using improvised weapons. Dust filled the air. Blood spilled across the yard. and chaos spread in every direction. Guards blew their whistles and rushed down from the watchtowers, gripping their batons and trying to separate the clashing groups. Danny Trejo stood in the middle of the crowd with two fellow inmates when a rival group rushed toward them. He stepped back and noticed a rock on the ground, roughly the size of a grown man's fist. Danny bent down, grabbed it, gripped it tightly in his right hand, and hurled it toward the attacking prisoners. But in the exact moment, the rock left his hand. A uniformed guard lieutenant ran across its path. The rock struck the lieutenant in the head with full force. The officer staggered as blood began pouring from the wound. Danny had aimed at another inmate, but the reality of the moment was undeniable. A correctional officer had been injured by his throw. The alarm sirens screamed across the yard. Riot control teams rushed in carrying shields. Several guards charged directly at Danny, slamming him to the ground, pressing his face into the concrete, twisting his arms behind his back, and snapping handcuffs tightly around his wrists. They dragged him out of the yard and straight into the prison's disciplinary wing, where the solitary confinement cells were located. The guards shoved him into a narrow cell, removed the cuffs, and slammed the thick metal door shut. Prison authorities immediately filed charges against Danny Trejo for the attempted murder of a correctional officer under California law at that time. The charge carried the highest possible punishment: death in the gas chamber. Officials decided to make an example of him, hoping the case would send a warning to thousands of other inmates across the system. Danny was locked inside that tiny, solitary cell for 3 months, from May until August of 1968. He had just turned 24 years old. The cell measured only a few square meters. There was no real window, only a narrow slit where a thin line of light leaked through. No voices, no conversation. Meals were pushed through a small opening at the bottom of the door. Each 24-hour day passed in near total silence, stripping the mind of normal sensory input to keep himself from going insane. Danny created routines. He would stand up, walk 4 steps to the wall, turn around, walk 4 steps back, and repeat the movement over and over again. He began replaying entire movies from memory, acting them out alone in the empty cell. One of the films he recreated was The Wizard of Oz. He changed his voice to play Dorothy. Then he deepened his voice to become the Cowardly Lion. He spoke every line out loud, answering himself as different characters. For hours each day, he performed these imaginary scenes, just to create sound in the silence and keep his mind alive. But when the acting stopped, and he sat alone against the wall, another thought took over his mind: the gas chamber. He imagined the moment the guards would open the door, read the execution order, strap him into the metal chair, and release poison gas into the chamber until his heart stopped. Cornered, with no lawyer, no money, and no weapon left to fight with, Danny finally did something he had never done before. He dropped to his knees on the concrete floor, clasped his hands together, and spoke to God. He said the words slowly and clearly, as if making a final agreement. God, you do not have to get me out of here. I know I have done terrible things. Just let me die with dignity. And if you let me live, I will say your name every day and help my fellow man. While Danny sat alone in that cell, prison investigators were questioning every inmate who had been in the Soledad yard on May 5th. One by one, they called prisoners into interrogation rooms, asking them to confirm that Danny Trejo had thrown the rock. But prison culture followed a strict, unwritten rule. Anyone who testified for the authorities became a snitch, and a snitch would almost certainly be stabbed the moment he returned to the cell block. So every prisoner gave the same answer: I did not see anything. Thousands of inmates were questioned. Not a single one agreed to sign a statement. After 3 months, prosecutors had no witnesses and no evidence strong enough to convince a jury. The attempted murder charge against Danny Trejo was dropped entirely. One day, the guards opened the solitary cell door and told him the case was gone. The death penalty was off the table. He would be returned to the regular prison population. Danny understood exactly what had happened to him. The dismissed charge was proof that the agreement he had made in that silent cell still stood. He immediately signed up for the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings held inside the prison. He sat with the other inmates, stood up in front of the group, admitted his addiction, and refused every offer of drugs, marijuana, or homemade prison alcohol. From 1968 onward, Danny Trejo began living completely sober. He spent his time reading textbooks, studying, and eventually passing the exams required to earn his high school diploma while still behind bars. Then, on August 23, 1969, after prison officials reviewed his behavior and confirmed his commitment to sobriety, the Soledad administration signed an early release order. After years inside the prison system, Danny Trejo finally walked out as a free man. When Danny Trejo finally walked out through the prison gates, he began rebuilding his life the only way he knew how, through physical labor. He bought a lawnmower, carried it through neighborhoods, and rang doorbells one house at a time, offering to cut grass in exchange for cash. Later, he took a job in construction, hauling heavy materials, pouring concrete, and doing whatever work was needed. His determination stood out. Over time, he earned a promotion to foreman, supervising teams of workers during the construction of the famous Cinerama Dome in Los Angeles. In 1973, he took another step forward. Danny enrolled in professional training courses and earned certification as a drug rehabilitation counselor. His daily mission became clear. He drove from school to school, standing in front of classrooms filled with teenagers and telling them the truth about addiction. He spoke openly about the day he first pushed a needle into his arm at 12 years old, about the shock of overdosing, and about the brutal stabbings he had witnessed inside San Quentin. His goal was simple: destroy the illusion that drugs were exciting or glamorous. He gave struggling addicts his personal phone number. When the phone rang at 2 in the morning and a trembling voice on the other end begged for help before relapsing, Danny would throw off the blankets, pull on his shoes, and drive through the night. He would arrive at their house, pull them out of their chair, take them to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, brew coffee, and sit beside them until sunrise if necessary, doing whatever it took to keep heroin out of their bodies. Then, late one night in 1985, something unexpected happened. Danny was 41 years old and had been sober for 16 years. A young man who had once attended a recovery meeting called him in a panic. The man said he was at work and cocaine was everywhere on the table. He was begging Danny to come immediately before he gave in. Danny asked for the address, got into his car, and drove to the location. But when he arrived and stepped inside, he realized something strange. This was not an office. It was a movie set. The location was the filming site of Runaway Train, directed by Andrei Konchalovsky and starring Jon Voight and Eric Roberts. Dozens of extras stood around wearing striped prison uniforms. Makeup artists had painted fake scars and tattoos on their skin, while the actors tried to look tough enough to pass as hardened inmates. Danny Trejo walked through the set wearing a short-sleeved shirt, his real tattoos exposed, his face marked with deep scars earned through years of violence and survival. The physical presence of a man who had actually spent 11 years inside some of the most dangerous prisons in California immediately caught the attention of a casting assistant. The assistant approached him and offered $50 a day if he would appear as an extra in the background. Danny accepted. At that exact moment, another figure recognized him, the film's screenwriter, Edward Bunker, himself a former San Quentin inmate, spotted Danny across the set. Bunker remembered him clearly. Danny Trejo had once been the prison boxing champion. Bunker introduced him to the production team and suggested that Danny train Eric Roberts in realistic boxing techniques for a fight scene. Just like that, Danny's pay jumped from $50 to $320 a day. When Danny put on the gloves and began teaching Eric Roberts how to throw real punches on a makeshift boxing ring, director Andrei Konchalovsky stood nearby watching closely. He saw something raw and authentic in Danny's movements: the strength, the control, the experience behind every motion. The director made a decision. Danny Trejo would not just train the actors, he would appear on screen. Konchalovsky expanded his role, giving him a speaking part and casting him as the inmate who actually steps into the ring to fight Eric Roberts. When Runaway Train was released, the film received several Academy Award nominations, and for the first time, Danny Trejo's face appeared on the map of Hollywood. From that moment forward, the phone never stopped ringing. Directors began calling him for new projects. In 1993, he appeared in Blood In, Blood Out, a film that used the real San Quentin prison as one of its filming locations. Walking through the familiar prison tiers, Danny eventually stopped in front of cell C550. It was the very cell where he had once been locked away between 1966 and 1968. He stepped inside with another actor, dropped to his knees on the concrete floor, closed his eyes, and offered a quiet prayer. He thanked God for freeing him from the prison system and from the grip of addiction. Then he stood up, walked out of the cell, and returned to work in front of the cameras. His acting career continued to grow with major films. In 1995, he appeared in Heat alongside Robert De Niro. The same year, he appeared in Desperado. In 1997, he shared the screen with Nicolas Cage in Con Air. His collaboration with distant cousin and director Robert Rodriguez brought him one of his most recognizable characters, Isidore Cortez, better known as Machete, in the Spy Kids series between 2001 and 2003. Then, in 2010, at 66 years old, Danny Trejo finally became the leading man. He starred in the action film Machete, performing brutal fight scenes that included beheading enemies and racing motorcycles equipped with machine guns. The film became a global hit. By that point, Danny Trejo had built an extraordinary career with more than 400 roles across films, television shows, animated voice acting, and video games, earning millions of dollars along the way. In 2010, while promoting the film Machete, Danny Trejo began noticing alarming changes in his body. The fatigue would not go away. A deep pain in his lower abdomen kept getting worse. Eventually, he drove himself to a hospital in Los Angeles. Doctors had him lie down, drew blood for testing, and sent him in for a CT scan. When the image of his liver appeared on the screen, the diagnosis became clear. Danny had liver cancer. Using electronic measurements, doctors identified a malignant tumor attached to the surface of the right lobe of his liver. It was 10 centimeters wide, about the size of an adult man's fist. The situation was urgent. The cancer carried a serious risk of spreading. When he left the hospital, Danny made a decision. He would keep everything secret. There would be no press conference, no statement from his representatives. He would not tell directors he was working with in Hollywood. News like that could end a career overnight. The film industry runs on insurance and risk calculations, and an actor with a life-threatening illness can become too expensive to insure. Danny feared producers would remove him from upcoming projects, cancel deals that were still being negotiated, and cut off the income his family depended on. The fear of being pushed aside and abandoned took over his mind. The tumor was too large to remove through surgery, and doctors ruled out standard chemotherapy. Instead, they chose a targeted medical treatment. Danny lay in a hospital bed as doctors made a small incision in his skin and inserted an extremely thin catheter into an artery. They guided it through his blood vessels to the artery feeding the tumor in his liver. Then they injected tiny radioactive particles into the vessel, carried by the bloodstream. The particles surrounded the tumor and released high-dose radiation meant to destroy the DNA of the cancer cells. The treatment continued for months, and it took a brutal toll on his body. He endured intense pain deep in his abdomen, rapid weight loss, and exhaustion that spread through his arms and legs. But filming contracts did not stop just because he was sick. Every morning he still had to get up, brush his teeth, get dressed, and drive to set. Makeup artists covered the paleness in his face. He picked up prop guns, threw punches, and performed physically demanding action scenes. When the director called "cut," he stepped back, fought to control his breathing, and kept the pain hidden inside. At the end of the day, he drove home, shut the bedroom door, collapsed onto the bed, and endured the violent cramps caused by radiation treatment alone. Then, after the treatment was over, a new CT scan brought the news he had been waiting for. The 10-centimeter tumor was completely gone. The cancer cells had been destroyed. Danny Trejo had beaten liver cancer. But the experience left him with a permanent rule. During treatment, doctors prescribed powerful opioid painkillers. He brought the medication home, opened the bottle, took the pills out, looked at them, and threw them away. He refused to take even one. The memory of heroin in the 1950s came rushing back. He understood exactly how close opioid pain medicine could be to the chemistry of addiction, and he feared that a single pill could wake up the craving he had fought to keep buried since 1968. So, when the pain came, he made another choice. He clenched his teeth, drank water, lay still with his eyes closed, and waited for it to pass on its own, refusing to put more chemicals into his body. On August 7, 2019, at the age of 75, Danny Trejo was driving through the Sylmar area of Los Angeles as his car approached an intersection. Another vehicle ran a red light and slammed directly into the side of a sport utility vehicle that had the right-of-way. The force of the collision was enormous. The SUV was thrown into the air, flipping over before crashing back onto the asphalt. It skidded across the road and came to rest completely upside down. The windshield shattered into fragments. Glass scattered across the pavement, and white smoke began rising from the engine compartment. Danny immediately hit the brakes, pulled over, and jumped out of his car. A young woman named Monica Jackson also rushed toward the wreckage, bending down and looking through the broken window frame. Danny saw a terrifying scene. In the back seat was a 5-year-old boy with autism. Because the vehicle had flipped over, the child's entire body was hanging upside down. The safety straps of the child's seat were tightly pressed across his chest and shoulders while the boy cried in panic. In the front seat, the child's grandmother was trapped between the steering wheel and the crushed roof of the vehicle, completely unable to move. The smell of leaking fuel filled the air, raising the risk of an explosion. Danny dropped to both knees on the asphalt covered with shattered glass and pushed the upper half of his body inside the vehicle, stretching his right arm toward the child's seat. He tried to press the release button, but the twisted frame of the damaged door blocked his movement, and he could not push the latch hard enough. Danny pulled back and pointed toward the opposite window, instructing Monica to crawl inside from the other side. She followed his directions, reached the release button, and pressed it firmly with her thumb. The moment the safety latch released, the straps loosened. Danny slid his large hands under the boy's arms, caught the child's falling weight, lifted him free from the seat, and carried him out of the smoking vehicle, holding the boy tightly against his chest. He moved quickly away from the wreck. When firefighters arrived and began cutting the metal frame to rescue the grandmother, the boy stood on the sidewalk crying in fear. Danny wrapped his arms around him and gently turned the child's back toward the accident scene so he would not see the car being torn apart. drawing on his experience as a counselor. Danny lowered his voice and spoke directly to the boy. He told him they needed to use their superpowers. Danny crossed his arms over his chest, flexed his muscles, and made a serious superhero face, encouraging the boy to copy him. The child looked up at Danny's scarred face, slowly stopped crying, flexed his tiny muscles, and began to smile. Danny kept him focused on the game until the situation was under control. Video of the rescue quickly spread across news broadcasts. The same hands that once carried grenades during robberies in the 1960s had now used every ounce of strength to pull a child away from the edge of death. His commitment to helping others did not stop with moments of crisis. Danny used his Hollywood earnings to create long-term opportunities for people who needed a second chance. In 2016, he launched the restaurant chain Trejo's Tacos, serving Mexican food. The business later expanded with Trejo's Coffee and Donuts, along with several cookbooks. But the most important rule inside these businesses was one he personally established. Managers were instructed to prioritize job applications from people with criminal records, former prisoners who had just been released, and individuals working through addiction recovery programs. Danny hired them, paid them real wages, gave them uniforms, and taught them how to work and serve customers with pride. He often stepped into the kitchen himself, cooking alongside employees who had once been incarcerated, offering them a path back into society through honest work instead of crime. The life of Danny Trejo is a journey through some of the harshest environments imaginable. A child who woke each morning with his father's hands around his throat became a teenager overdosing on heroin at 12 years old. That teenager turned into an armed robber and eventually a prison boxing champion inside San Quentin. The man who once sat alone in a solitary cell facing the possibility of execution made a desperate promise to God on a cold concrete floor. For more than half a century, he has lived out that promise through action. On screen, Danny Trejo often plays ruthless villains, but in real life, his story became something else entirely. It is the story of a man who walked out of darkness, survived cancer, and spent the rest of his life giving something back to the world that once nearly destroyed him.